Hello everyone. Welcome to this first lecture that is part of the module titled The Fractured Identity of Nation. In this section, we will primarily focus on the historical aspect of how nation building was not just a struggle against the British colonizers. In fact, even within the nation, the differences based on caste, gender, class, religion created a crisis, as a result of which the idea of nation was fractured. The anti-caste movements highlighted that there is no one single identity called Indian citizen. It is in fact rooted in specificities of caste, class, gender and so on, and these were all intersecting identities. Now, before we go into the history of these alternative articulations, it is important to first understand what caste system really means. Historical analysis reveals that caste has appeared as an integral part of Indian society, alive for 3000 years and expanding its grip till date. Although opinions vary regarding the manner and method of its operation, putatively the major reason for the survival of the caste system has been its flexibility, which makes it compatible to adapt to any condition and system of oppression. It thereby transforms itself into a desired form of oppression. Since the time of its inception, the caste system has subdivided itself into multiple subcastes, also known as jatis, in order to encompass every different social stratification into its fora. Sociology defines caste system as a term denoting an extreme form of social differentiation, hierarchically organized within a rigid system of stratification. In such kind of a system, a person's social position is determined by birth, by marital connections, wherein one's outside caste is prohibited. Widely distributed through four varnas, Brahmin, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras, caste system is divided into four subcategories, as I said, jatis. In fact, there is also a fifth group known as Shudrati Shudras or Ati Shudras, also known as untouchables, who are placed even lower than the Shudras. This social categorization, inherent in Indian life and rooting its seed in the Hindu religion, functions through four major components. The first of which is endogamy, or marriage within one's varna and jati, which ensures the continuation of caste system among the progenies and the blood retained within the boundaries of particular castes. The second aspect is also labor, possession of land and purity and pollution system that creates hierarchy among castes. However, it is worth mentioning here that caste system in the Indian subcontinent has not remained limited within Hindu religion alone. Writings by Dalit Christians, Dalit Muslims prove that caste is not a religion specific matter any longer. Geographical boundaries, in fact, prove to be more important while determining the expansion of caste system than the narrow quarters of a single religion. In other words, caste system is profoundly visible in the Indian subcontinent rather than a particular religion. This hierarchical institution of caste is a closed birth-based system where every person born into a caste invariably belongs to that same caste till his or her death. This is the reason why when we speak of caste, we talk of it as a horizontal category wherein no upward mobility is possible, and this is unlike class. And this is the reason why I would like to remind you all that caste cannot be equated with class, because there is hierarchical or vertical mobility is possible with class, but with caste there is no mobility possible. Now, although references are available in ancient scriptures about movement through castes, when women of lower castes marry men from the castes higher than them, in more recent times, individual social mobility in castes is almost absent. And this is made possible through the continual practice of endogamous marriage, an issue which Ambedkar specifically mentions as the endemic reason for the proliferation and sustenance of caste system. Now, in an effort to understand how caste system is constituted by multiple and mutually intersecting components, Ambedkar argues, and I quote, "Caste in India means an artificial chopping off the population into fixed definite units, each one prevented from fusing into another through the custom of endogamy. Thus, the conclusion is inevitable that endogamy is the only characteristic that is peculiar to caste. And if we succeed in showing how endogamy is maintained, we shall practically have proved the genesis and also the mechanism of caste." Unquote. Ambedkar's analysis of the origin and operation of caste system reveals it as what Ambedkar himself calls a parcelling of an already homogeneous unit. In order to explain this process, Ambedkar centralizes his argument on endogamy as a mechanism that protects and perpetuates caste system. Endogamy, that is the process of fixing marriages within castes, justifies the exclusivity of caste groups and ascertains the logic of birth-based origin. In an extremely nuanced understanding of the cause and effect of endogamy, Ambedkar propounds the issue of parity between marriageable units within specific castes. This is what he calls the parity of units, and we will take it up in the upcoming lectures as well. Now, coming back to the point of endogamous marriage, Ambedkar notes that India in the ancient period was primarily exogamous. In a clan-based community, exogamy or marriage outside one's caste helped maintain unity among different castes and clans through marriage. As a result, marriage within one's blood kin and within the same class was highly discouraged. Now, commenting on the division of labor being an often debated feature of caste system, Christopher J. Fuller writes, I quote, "In theory, the caste system defines a division of labor, and in practice, many occupations are caste specific, especially in the services and the artisan sectors. Nevertheless, the division of labor has never been fully determined by caste." Unquote. Now, despite the contradictions among sociologists regarding the validity of division of labor as a caste specification, the ever increasing influence of caste as the reservoir and enthusiast of social inequality and discrimination remains undisputed. In this hierarchical system, at the top are the Brahmins and at the bottom are the various castes such as untouchables and so on. But as M. N. Srinivas mentions, in some villages, one caste which is not often Brahmin caste turns out to be the dominant caste because it exercises preponderant control over the agrarian economy and the local political system. So, herein we come across the term called the dominant caste, which may or may not be constituted of the Brahmin groups depending on the region that we are talking about. Now, the second aspect that I said constitutes the caste system is the division of labor. The division of labor within caste system has been a subject of extensive debate among sociologists and anthropologists. To go back to Christopher Fuller once again, in his analysis, Fuller highlights both the theoretical and practical dimensions of this feature. He states, I quote, "In theory, the caste system defines a division of labor, and in practice many occupations are caste specific. Nevertheless, the division of labor has never been fully determined by caste." Now, this suggests that while caste based occupational roles have historically been rigidly assigned, the caste system has not always functioned with absolute determinism. Social mobility, economic changes, and regional variations have allowed for the deviations from strictly caste bound labor divisions. This perception, however, is not entirely true. Take for example, sewage cleaning and the sewage cleaners, wherein the caste system remains restricted to untouchable caste through centuries. In fact, it remains a deeply entrenched structure that perpetuates social hierarchy and exclusion, reinforcing inequalities in both economic and social spheres. Though some sociologists debate the extent to which caste dictates occupation, there is little dispute regarding caste's role in sustaining discrimination and social inequality. Within this hierarchical system, the Brahmins, traditionally considered the priestly and scholarly class, occupy the highest position, while those belonging to the so-called lower castes such as Dalits, who are formerly known as untouchables, Shudras and other marginalized communities are placed at the bottom. The structure inequality has persisted over centuries, shaping access to resources, opportunities and social mobilities. And this is the reason why in Caste in Modern India and other essays, M.N. Srinivas actually introduces the concept of dominant caste, wherein the most influential caste is not necessarily the Brahmins, but rather a group that wields significant control over economic and political structures. Now, this caste, often composed of landowners and economically powerful groups, asserts its dominance by influencing social customs, labor relations, and even access to local governance. Such cases highlight the complex and dynamic nature of caste power, where economic and political authority can sometimes outweigh the traditional ritual supremacy proclaimed by the highest caste. Thus, while the caste system is often understood in terms of rigid hierarchy, sociological analysis reveal that it also operates through fluid, context-specific structures of power that extend beyond mere occupational roles. Whether through ritual stages of economic and political influence, caste continues to be a decisive factor in India's social and economic landscape. From these readings, we can come to the following understanding, that is, caste system is perhaps one of the most ambiguous and evasive social practices that continues to persist. The Manusmriti suggests with punctual details the extreme rigidity of caste regulations, but at the same time it professes the laxity of such rules wherein inter-caste union among upper caste men and lower caste women were allowed with minimal retribution. This leads to the conclusion that caste system is intended to retain social hierarchy and it works in favor of a handful few powerful, in this case the Brahmins and the upper castes. Thus, all of a sudden it becomes clear that while presenting a polemical historical critique of caste, we need to approach it through the lens of Brahminical patriarchal angle. Now, just to revise how the system functions, as it appears in the early Brahminical scriptures such as the Vedas, there are 4 branches of Indian caste system representing Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras in the hierarchical order. The Brahmins, who were at the highest position of the social labor, monopolized the position of priests and teachers in the Vedic era. The Kshatriyas were involved in politics and military affairs and represented what we may call, in a much more contemporary term, the macho hero today. The Vaishyas formed the commoner ranks of cultivators, herders, and the merchants, and the Shudras were the lowest rung of the strata, forced to opt for servitude of the upper castes. However, as I mentioned earlier, there is yet another caste, often allegedly added at a later date, called the untouchables, in which the Shudrati Shudras such as the Chandalas, who are the people who are in charge of burning dead bodies, were put. Now, the lower castes were deprived of any facility the society provided: education, access to resources, access to water and so on and so forth. And the untouchables had to live outside the boundary of the village. Bringing in the reference of Varna and Jati mentioned earlier, we may see that the distinction is a juxtaposition of caste as given by birth and as carried through profession, something that Jyotirao Phule mentions in his wonderful analysis of the Aryan race theory, which we will be discussing in the upcoming lectures. It is an interlinked factor with those which are primarily linked with caste and which are ascertained through communal role, that is endogamy. Based on the principles of purity and pollution, caste was as much about keeping the polluted, that is the untouchables, away, as it were about maintaining the purity of the upper castes. Perceived thus, one can easily recognize the politics of centrality and marginalization the caste system was engraving in Indian society for centuries to come. The Dharma Shastra defined the Chandalas as people who pollute the twice born people either by direct or indirect contact. I quote from Paswan, Sanjay and so on, pollution will occur if these people were touched, conversed with or even looked upon. In the case of such pollution, rites of purification must be performed. If the Chandala was touched, you must be bathed, submerging the entire body. If conversed with, exchanged words with a Brahmana, if looked upon, observe the lights, sun, moon or stars. Causing more impurity like intercourse with a Chandala woman required more difficult penances, including fasting like Shudras. Chandalas were completely excluded from the religious, that is Brahmanistic practices of twice born. Now, one may ask the question that in this spectrum of caste, where do we place the lower caste women? What was their condition? Now, in the Jataka stories, we find evidences of lower caste women working alongside lower caste men, giving us the glimpse of a certain amount of, at least in terms of labor, as to how gender really functioned, which was often absent within the upper caste groups. The lower caste women were not only allowed to go outside the threshold of the house and participate in the work that the lower caste men performed, they were also often seen to be marrying outside their caste communities, and they were also allowed to remarry in case of the death of a husband. However, instances of their extreme exploitation in the hands of upper caste men are mentioned extensively. Treated as a property of the upper caste people, the lower caste women were victims of public and gang rape. Despite such picturizations, we never hear lower caste women's voices. Perceived as lustful women, deprived of any moral sensibility, lower caste women, much like the black women in America, were thrice oppressed. Christopher J. Fuller once again mentions, I quote, "According to the laws of Manu in Manusmriti, which attained its final form about 1000 years ago, untouchables were created from illicit, that is hypogamous unions between Shudra men and women of higher classes. Indeed, on the origins and early development of the caste system, there are hardly any sound data, so that most modern scholars have rightly abandoned speculations about them." Now, it is important to mention at this point as to how the Manusmriti and other Vedic scriptures often saw the discrimination in which the way the lower caste men and the lower caste women were treated. As a major feature or limitation one faces while discussing about caste is that there is no fixed meaning or definition of it. Depending on the political, social, cultural and economic changes, caste has perceived an enormous shift around its conceptualization. In the next lectures, we will delve deep into the various anti-caste movements and the leaders. Thank you.